In this bonus video, I'll show you how to finish edges using an overlock machine, and also how to set the thread tension on a 4-thread overlock machine, which is a bit complicated. So I'll sew a bit here and show you what the stitches should look like if they're done right. This is a very thin fabric, a light poplin, and because it's so thin, it's all the more difficult to get the machine settings right. Here we see the green thread, and here's a tip from me, use different color threads. That makes it easier to set the tension. Here I have the needle on the left, that's the green thread. Here there aren't any loops, just very nice puncture points and the holding stitches. On the back, here, we see the holding stitches, the green ones. They could even disappear a bit more. Let me show you, they're all still noticeable and they should be less so. Here I have the second thread, the blue one. That's the needle on the right. It runs along here. Also makes a very nice stitch going in here and immediately disappearing back here. Then I have the upper thread, which makes these loops here. What's important here is if this thread is too tight, it pulls the lower thread, the red one, through here like this. Or it pushes together the entire overlock seam. I mean, the edge of the fabric that we're finishing together like this. So it mustn't be too loose either. The main thing is that the holding stitches here between the upper and the lower thread align precisely along this edge. And here's a pro tip for you. If it's mostly looking good, but then there's a spot where everything seems totally out of whack, or like here again, then check on your thread paths. With this particular model, you can pull this attachment up like a telescopic rod. Now you need to understand this should be pretty high, because this is where the thread comes from, and you want the spool to unwind as smoothly as possible. If this attachment is too low, there will be spots where the spool gets crooked and wobbles a bit. And this wobbling motion, which is very slight at this end, affects the thread tension, so all of a sudden you have tension in the machine that pulls on the thread, resulting in a glitch in an otherwise clean overlock stitch. So always check the paths and make sure nothing is twisted, and that the thread path is ideally always directly above the spool. That's the prerequisite for being able to set the thread tension properly. Once I've found the right settings, I take a picture of them, and also of the fabric, like this poplin, for example. Now, when I try it with a more substantial fabric, I might have to adjust the tension here a little bit. Probably not the needle tension, but the tension of the upper and lower loopers, to ensure that at the edge of the seam, the holding stitches remain exactly on the edge of the fabric. And then I take another photo of the settings for that particular fabric. And of course I do the same for the lining. Now I'm going to have 2 pieces of cloth. The benefit of a 4-thread overlock machine is that it not only finishes the edges, but it also allows you to simultaneously enclose the seam. Now it's important to check the green thread. That's the left needle that actually joins the 2 layers together. Pull it apart like this, and make sure you have a nice clean stitch here. And if that's the case, if I only see very little of the green thread, then I've done it right. If I had long loops here, for example, or if everything looked different and not uniform, then you would need to tighten or loosen the thread tension. Normally, I would use white thread with this fabric, and then I wouldn't see anything at all and would be very satisfied with the way this stitch looks. Now I'll show you what happens if we modify one thread. It's important to take a photo or carefully write down your settings. So here I'm going to change the thread of the upper looper, which is the green thread in this setup. For example, I can loosen the tension. Right now it's set to 4. I'll set it to 2, and you can see the change immediately. Now the looper threads are interlocking here. That means the holding stitches are no longer on the top of the edge where they were before. They've been pulled down to one side. Because now the lower thread is too tight compared to the upper thread. So the lower thread, although we didn't change its tension at all, is now pulling the entire stitch backwards, as it were, distorting the fabric. And that creates this ruffling effect. If you run your fingers over it, the edge feels a lot rougher here than it did when the settings were correct. Now I'll tighten the tension here, and we can see the opposite happening. The red thread, that's the lower thread, is coming to the top. And that again gives us a rough feeling to the touch. And the same thing happens if you adjust this setting too. So give it a few tries until you get it right. We'll start with the settings for the left needle, which is the green thread. We make sure it's right first. And then we check the other side again and make sure we're happy with the results. Next, we take care of the second needle. We make sure it's not making any little loops. Once both the needles are set right, we don't have to worry about them anymore. Then all we have to do is take care of the lower and upper loops. These two, this thread, and this thread. So now I'm going to tighten the tension of the red thread, the lower thread. Let me show you what happens. When the lower thread is tighter, of course it pulls the green thread over this edge here, and then it looks like this. And that's what we're trying to avoid. So always set the left needle first, then the right needle. They're the easiest to take care of. And then try it and concentrate on the other two threads until the holding stitches are really over here where we want them. Take a picture of your settings so you can make the necessary adjustments quickly the next time, and you'll always have attractive stitches and seams. Now we'll try the same thing with a lining fabric. I'm sewing these two pieces together, and this is going to be more difficult because it's a very thin fabric, but we'll give it a try. This side looks very good. The green thread, that's the left needle, is in the right place. The second needle looks good too. But here we have the problem that the holding stitches are not on the edge. Some of them are, but most of them are not. That means either the red thread is too tight or the green thread is too loose. I'll loosen the red thread just a little bit. It really doesn't take much. Now you can see how different the seam looks. We're on the edge now, and the seam is no longer causing the lining to pucker, or at least only very little. This seam is fine for such a thin lining material. When I pull this apart, the inside also looks very good. So now you can take another picture of these settings. Now that we have set the thread tension, the most difficult part is not finishing the edges, but the corners. Let's look at them now. Here, where we're sewing a straight line, I can just guide the fabric right here next to the blade. The blade is not there to cut the fabric, but if there are any loose threads on the edge, they'll be trimmed off. This particular fabric doesn't really unravel much, so there isn't much fringe to be concerned about. But many fabrics do unravel at the edge, and all those loose threads would bunch up and cause bumps if we didn't trim them off. And that's what the blade is for. So I position the fabric against the blade like this. The loose fringe will be trimmed off, but not the fabric itself. Because, of course, you're working with a seam allowance of just 1 centimeter. The overlock seam takes up 2 millimeters of that seam allowance, and if I trim off more fabric and reduce that allowance by even more here and there, and then later adhere to the 1 centimeter seam allowance, if you do that often enough, after a while, the garment is going to be too tight. So watch out for the blade when you're finishing your edges. It's only there to trim off the loose fringe threads. Now I'll show you how to do the corners. It's not difficult in this case. I just sew a little past the end while trying to ensure that the extra loop is as small as possible. The hard part is a corner like this one. So let's see how it turns out. First, I release the presser foot and pivot everything around. With the 4-thread overlock and its 2 needles, I really have to sew to the end of the fabric before I can pivot it around. And then I lower the presser foot back down and continue sewing. Now we're about to reach this corner, and as you can see, the presser foot is so long that I can't sew all the way to this corner and keep going, because the distance between the blade and the needle is 2 centimeters, and I would cut 2 centimeters into the fabric here. So I hold the fabric around like this, so it's almost a straight line again. I'll show you what I mean. And this is what the corner then looks like. Basically, I just turned it in such a way that I was sewing in a straight line. I think we can be satisfied with this corner. Now, I'll show you how to do this with a 3-thread overlock machine. The difference between overlocking with 3 or 4 threads is that the 4th thread actually secures the seam. So when I'm sewing 2 pieces of fabric together, the 4-thread overlock is better because it gives you a nice, secure seam. This seam is a little wider and is self-enclosed, like we saw earlier. But if I don't want my overlock seam to join 2 pieces of cloth together, I don't need that 4th thread. 3 are enough. So I didn't thread the left needle, and of course that means I have to make some adjustments to my tension settings. I have 3 threads in here. This is the right needle. And the thread looks good on this side and is hardly visible from the back. With fabric this thin, all you can see are these little stitches. With a thicker fabric, even these stitches would disappear in the fabric. Then, like before, we have the upper looper and the lower looper. Together, they enclose the fabric here. The thinner the fabric, the looser the tension needs to be. Otherwise, it will cause the fabric to pucker and warp. That's why I use the medium setting, which is suitable for a thicker or a thinner fabric. And again, I photograph the settings to make it easier for me to make any necessary adjustments later. Here too, it's important that the holding stitches are right on the edge and haven't shifted to the front or the back. When you run your finger across it, it feels relatively smooth. If the holding stitches were someplace else, you'd have the problem of puckering, this warping or distortion. For the settings, again, I start with the thread that goes through the needle, in this case the yellow one. It has to be right first, and then I can figure out the settings for the other two to keep the holding stitches right out here and ensure that everything stays flat. Whenever I'm switching back and forth from using one needle or two, I leave the second needle in the machine. But when I'm doing a lot of sewing with just one needle, I remove the second needle, because it's easier when you don't have to take into consideration that it is making holes in the fabric here. And especially with finer fabrics, you don't really want those second needle holes, because they will remain visible later. So you can use 2 needles with 4 threads, or 1 needle with 3 threads. Whenever I'm finishing a lot of edges where I'm not joining 2 pieces of fabric together, so I just have a single layer of cloth, it would be a waste of thread to do it all with 4 threads. And it would be unnecessarily thick as well. So I remove a needle, change all the settings so they're appropriate for 3 threads, and finish the edges using 3 threads and 1 needle. It's just that the tension setting for 4 threads is different from the setting for 3 threads, because you're sewing a much more narrow seam. With 4 threads, it would extend to here. And of course, I have to adjust these 2 knobs as well, which is why I always recommend taking a photo, because then you can just look at the settings and recreate them. It's much faster that way. There's less trial and error. At the Tailor Academy, we nearly always use 3 threads because we usually press our seams apart. And if you want to press the seams apart, you don't want to overlock them together. That would make no sense. Our main priority is ensuring a good, attractive seam, and in most cases that means pressing the ends apart. Now you know how to set the various kinds of overlock machines. Have fun putting it into practice.